Welcome to The Other Side, Mississippi Today's political podcast. I'm your host, Adam Ganishow. The Other Side lets you hear directly from the most connected players and observers across the spectrum of politics in Mississippi. From breaking news to political strategy to interviews with candidates and elected officials, we'll bring you facts, perspectives, and context that helps you cut through the noise and understand all sides of the story.
I'm Bobby Harrison. Thankful for y'all tuning in, or listening. I don't know if you tune into a podcast, listening during the holiday season. I'm here today with my guest, Ray Higgins, who is the Executive Director of the Mississippi Public Employees Retirement System, PERS, as it is known. Mr. Higgins, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's great to visit with you today.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of ground to cover with you. PERS may be it's probably the biggest in terms of just money, the biggest entity in state government, and people may not realize that, but y'all deal with a lot of money. Tell us, and a lot's going on with PERS right now. So just kind of, before we get into those things, just give us sort of a snapshot for the 2 or 3 people listening who may not know what PERS is.
Sure. Well, certainly you touched on one thing about how important it is and how large it is. We're around $34 billion as of this morning in assets. And PERS is the Public Employees Retirement System, and we're the state's pension fund, if you will, and we basically cover all of the non-federal government positions in the state.
That's city and counties, school teachers, of course, the state agencies, the universities. So how many people are in the system? Retirees, and I mean, isn't it about 350,000?
It is. It's over 350,000, and that also illustrates the importance. It's so important, not only to our membership, but to the entire state of Mississippi.
Economically, you're speaking.
Economically, and in terms of people. On the economic side, we pay out over $3 billion in benefits annually, and that ripples throughout the economy. Over 90% of that stays in the state of Mississippi, generating a lot of economic activity.
And I guess when everything's going well, you don't hear much from PERS in terms of from people like me. But currently it's kind of confusing in a sense, because there's some people that think that there's absolutely no issues with PERS. Other people say that there's issues that are not being talked about enough. But at the very least, I think you and your board think that there are issues that need to be addressed both in the short term and the long term.
That's true, and not just us, but to comment on what you said, PERS is certainly stable. Certainly stable. There's no need for immediate alarm, and there's no urgency today. However, from a long-term perspective, we do need additional funding. We definitely need additional funding, more in line with the actuarial recommendations. And some pension reform is recommended as well. And by that I mean a Tier 5, which is referring to a new benefit structure for future employees. So PERS is certainly stable, but the time for very in-depth and tough conversations and additional funding and change is now.
And explain to people PERS sources of revenue, if that makes sense.
Sure, it's in employee contributions, employer contributions, and investment income, and over the last 30 years, the majority of the revenue comes from investment earnings, and a little less than a third comes from employer or taxpayer contributions, and then the remainder from the member contributions.
And for each employee's paycheck, the employee pays 9% of that paycheck toward their retirement.
That's correct. The member contribution is currently at 9%.
And refresh my memory on where the employer or taxpayer benefits are.
It was just increased to 17.9% starting in July.
And it is set to go up over the next so many years to 22%. Is that right?
No, sir. With the recent change in law of the last session, it will go up to 19.9%.
And just this recently, the PERS board, 10-member board, that it consists of the state treasurer and one appointee by the governor, and then the other 8 members are elected by the membership of PERS.
That's correct.
Yeah, and the PERS board recently, to address some of these issues, voted to recommend to the legislature a new Tier 5, as you referenced. Explain what the Tier 5 is and what y'all are what your board voted to do?
Sure. Well, first, let me say this as far as the concept of a Tier 5. A Tier 5 is referring to a different benefit structure for new employees to be hired at some point in the future. So only for future employees. And I've recommended a Tier 5 previously, and the board has acknowledged the need for a Tier 5 previously. In last session, the board recommended a particular Tier 5 for the legislature to consider. But more recently, this past week, the board voted to endorse what appears to be a particular type of model of a Tier 5, often referred to as a hybrid, that seems to be maybe favored by the legislature. And so the state, as the plan sponsor, has the ultimate responsibility to design the benefits and design the plan. So if the state would like to pursue a Tier 5 DB-DC hybrid that is designed and projected and estimated to help better sustain the current plan for the existing membership, then the board voted to endorse that type of proposal.
And the hybrid is I'm speaking way over my head now, but there's essentially two types of pension plans. There is what is known as a defined benefits plan, which is what PERS is.
That's correct.
And employee and employer pays into it throughout a person's work life with a particular agency or entity. And then when they retire, they get a guaranteed monthly benefit.
That's right, guaranteed benefit for life.
Now, and at one point in time in the history of the country, I think those were pretty common. And now a lot of private sector entities are moving away from those. I think that's safe to say.
That's safe to say.
And they're moving to what is known, I think, as a defined contribution plan.
That's correct.
And under the defined contribution plan, you pay into some type of investment, usually often a 401k, and maybe the employer pays in that too. And then when you retire, you can get one lump sum, which a lot of people do, or you can get a monthly benefit that is guaranteed based on the earnings of that 401k during its lifetime.
That's right. And
now, what y'all have recommended a hybrid of those? I may interrupt you. I'm sorry.
Sure. No problem.
Right.
That's right. The earlier part of this week, and that was a good description, but the hybrid, it refers to a combination of the DB and DC. And like you said, DB is defined benefit, like a traditional pension. The DC stands for defined contribution, more the 401k style, like you talked about. And the one that was explained and reviewed earlier this week is that hybrid. It's a combination. It has the essentially one half of the current PERS with a 1% multiplier. So it has that DB defined benefit portion along with the DC component. And be happy to unpack that further, but that's the
Go right ahead.
Okay. So the DB part would be a 1% multiplier. Current PERS now up to a certain amount has 2% multiplier for years of service. So it would be essentially the DB side, the traditional pension part, would be one half of current PERS. But then there would be this DC, defined contribution component as well. And we mentioned the 9% employee contribution. That would stay the same as this is currently contemplated, but only 4% would go toward the DB and the other 5% would go toward the DC side. And there were some other suggested changes in that particular model as well. It was a bit more of a simplified plan without some of the additional credit for such as sick leave and things like that. There wouldn't be a guaranteed COLA. It would be more of an ad hoc COLA at a later time to be determined.
Determined by, I guess it's up to what the legislature decides, but it'd be determined by the board, your board, or the legislature, I guess.
That's right.
Or maybe some other entity, but but that would seem kind of fruitless.
Yeah, it would just to be determined depending on how the law is possibly developed. But in the model that was discussed earlier, it wouldn't have a guaranteed COLA. And also some extended retirement eligibility and a few other changes like that. But the main thing being it would be that hybrid model.
Yeah. Well, and if I remember correctly, what y'all recommended last year, the Tier 5, y'all recommend, when I say y'all, I mean the PERS board, which you essentially, you work for the board. The board hired you to oversee this massive system. And what the board, I think, recommended last year that you took to the legislature was not a hybrid, but it did make changes to the COLA, the cost of living adjustment. Am I right about that?
That's exactly right. Last year, the board approved Tier 5, board recommended Tier 5. And this week's action is a little bit different, but last year's board approved Tier 5 was a revised DB type option. And it was very, very similar to current PERS, with the only changes being a reduced member contribution rate, a change in the vesting period, and as you mentioned, no guaranteed COLA. Instead of the guaranteed COLA, it was rather the possibility of a COLA tied to inflation, capped at 3%, and also based on funding availability at the time. More recently, this week, it was the consideration of the hybrid model, and it's my current belief that the state would like to consider that type of model. And what the board voted to do is the state, again, as the plan sponsor, if they want to.
When you say the state, you're essentially saying the legislature.
That's right, the legislature as the sponsor of the plan with the responsibility to design the benefits, is if they want to pursue the Tier 5 DBDC model. And if that model is projected to help improve the fiscal integrity of the current plan for existing members, the board voted to endorse that type of proposal.
For a lot of people, one of the most attractive aspects of the current system is the COLA, what a lot of people refer to lovingly as a 13th check. So, I mean, for a lot of people, the COLA is a big positive aspect to the current system. Talk a little bit about the current cost of living adjustment and why you feel that, I mean, several board members said it was part of the current plan that they did not think was going to be able to sustain into the future. So hence that's why the vote was to do away with the guaranteed COLA. Just talk a little bit about what it is and why it's going to be difficult to carry on in its current system.
Sure. Well, the additional annual benefit, commonly referred to as the COLA or cost of living adjustment, is outlined in law and has been that way for quite some time. And it's exactly as it sounds, cost of living adjustment. And it can be paid on a monthly basis or in a lump sum amount. The majority of retirees choose the lump sum amount. We just did that recently, and it was approximately $885 million. It's a very good benefit, very important benefit, but also has a cost. And the total, if we combine the lump sum along with the monthly amounts, it's a little higher, probably approaching $1 billion. But again, very important benefit.
$1 billion per year.
That's right.
Okay.
But a very, very important benefit. And also, even though that's a large number, the average COLA is much smaller than that. I want to say the average PERS benefit's probably around $27,000 annually, and that includes the cost of living adjustment. And I believe in the last actuarial reports, the average COLA is probably more around $7,800. I mean, obviously, I don't have those numbers in front of me, but it's smaller than the ones that I outlined. But that is outlined in the statute. Any changes to that would have to be done through a legislative change. As far as the going forward,
and it's 3% per year.
That's right. It's 3% simple
compounded.
After being retired for one full fiscal year. It's 3% per year simple up to a certain age, and then 3% compounded. And in some of the Tier 5 recommendations, the reason that though the guaranteed COLA is not recommended is to try to help better sustain the system long term, give the next generation some additional flexibility should we encounter adversity, and to lower those future projected liabilities, and hopefully relieve some pressure on the contribution rate increases.
Because this all kind of came about, these potential changes to a certain extent, because y'all were having, and I say y'all, the board, I'm sorry, the board voted to increase the contribution rate by the employers, and some of the employers, cities, counties, school districts, said that was going to put a big strain on their ability, because essentially that's money coming from their budget to pay for retirement, and they were saying they were not going to be able to continue their current services if they had to pay that to pay that additional contribution rate. In fairness to the board, I mean, the board's responsibility is to the membership of PERS.
Absolutely.
And to make sure that there's money in the system long term to sustain the retirees as time progresses. And so there's a effort to kind of walk to balance that the cost to the taxpayers and paying for, the money to retirees, and hence this is all coming about. I mean, so many. I mean, and y'all are so many local business. I mean, not local businesses, but businesses are moving, as I said, moving away from the defined benefits plan. But that's really not an option for you either.
Well, you mentioned one thing in there about the board, and I will just say we have a really good board, a very engaged board, and I certainly appreciate what they have done and currently do for the system and what they've done for me personally. And like you said, the board then and now is just doing their job as fiduciaries and as trustees, and the same for us. But I'm glad you mentioned funding, because I'd like to shift back to that just a little bit. I know we spent some time on the Tier 5 and the new benefit design, but what's really important to remember is PERS definitely needs some additional funding more in line with the actuarial recommendations. And really, regardless of a Tier 5 or the type of Tier 5, or when a Tier 5 is possibly implemented, the additional funding is most important and definitely necessary.
The additional funding, I mean, we're talking about additional funding, not to be over dramatic, but now.
That's right, starting now. That's right. And to give a little update on that, because we just completed our regular actuarial report, as well as 2 separate independent actuarial reports. And in summary, the results are all very similar and very consistent with last year and what the board had previously stated. And the recommended ADEC, as we call it, the actuarially determined contribution, is 25.92% of payroll.
Help me, hold on, Casey. I'm sorry. I'm gonna try not to ask you about the ADAC too much, but I've gone blank. I don't. Well, getting back to my original question. No. Leave that, and expound a little bit on why. Because, for some folks, they would just say, well, do what they did in the private sector and just go completely to a defined contribution plan and eliminate in the future the defined benefit package. But, I mean, that won't work for PERS because it's such a large system that, I mean, you got to have revenue and there's going to be, the revenue from the defined benefits package is needed to sustain the current system. I'm not explaining that very well, but I think you get a gist of what I'm saying.
Oh, that's okay. We certainly support the defined benefit structure, the existing plan, and then also the DB component of a potential hybrid. And if you like to go back to earlier parts of your question on some of the concerns that were expressed from employers, we're sympathetic to the cost on employers, but as fiduciaries, we have to do what we should for the system. And that's where our legal and fiduciary loyalty lies. What I would say on that is we appreciate where the employers are coming from, and we understand that. But if the state or the employers don't want to pay for the promises, then we need to consider making less promises. It's just, I can't emphasize how important PERS is to the membership and the state enough.
And but am I wrong? I'm not explaining it well, but it would just not be financially viable to completely stop the defined benefits plan because of the promises made to the current employees and the retirees have to be met, so you have to have the components of the defined benefit plan to do that.
I think I see one thing that you're getting at now, and if I forget to come back to the promises and the liabilities, please remind me to do that. But yes, I think what you might be talking about is something you may have heard of say before, that if you were to go to a total mandatory defined contribution and essentially close PERS, then that's going to have a cost. That's going to in the short term, definitely a cost because
it'll be a cost to the state.
That's right.
And cities and counties and.
That's right. There'd be an additional cost, especially in the short term for the foreseeable future, a significant extra increase in cost for the foreseeable future. There's pros and cons to every approach, but if you go to a full mandatory DC, you do have an increase in cost, and mainly that's because you already have and still have the current
you got 350,000 people.
Well, you have that, but you have the existing unfunded liability that's still there regardless.
Yeah.
And so you'd have the cost of that plus the cost of whatever a new potential DC alone would be.
And unfunded liability. Am I wrong to call it in news stories debt? is about $25 billion.
That's correct. The latest is around $26 billion, but you're correct. And you mentioned the liabilities, and if I could, I'd like to share when we're talking, because we talk a lot about liabilities and unfunded liabilities and things like that. And we need to make sure and remember in the context of PERS what we're referring to. When we say liability, that's someone's earned benefit. That's the teacher. That's the retired teacher. That's the first responder. That's, in this context, liability is earned benefit. And when we're talking about the need for additional funding and more of the long-term perspective, we're looking long-term and saying, okay, here's what we need. Here's what we have, and when that gap starts to widen a little bit, that's why we say that we need some additional funding long-term to make sure and keep those promises, because the promises made should be promises paid, and that's why additional funding is needed.
And there's actually court cases that back that up.
That's correct. That's correct. And and even though I've mentioned the need for additional funding, which is certainly true, and I think should be the priority, I think although change is hard, we also have previously recommended a Tier 5 and have endorsed the possibility of a hybrid model that the legislature may consider, as long as it. Yeah. And the main reason that the board voted to endorse that model is because the information that was explained by the actuary, that I also recommended as well. And again, none of us can predict the future, but based on the estimates and the projections we had, if it was showing to pay off the unfunded sooner, help reduce the pressure on the potential for increasing employer contribution rates, and there is that contribution rate risk, helping provide more of the employer contribution toward the unfunded liability, and like I said, to help better sustain the existing plan for the existing membership.
Now, last legislative session, we're coming up on a 2025 session, but in the 2024 session, there was a slight increase, I think a 0.5% increase in the amount the cities and counties and the state agencies put into this for each employee. And plus there was a cash infusion of, I think, about $110 million.
That's correct.
And you talk about the board talks about needing additional cash help with the system. In a perfect world, and this may be an unfair question, so bop me upside the head and tell me you can't answer it if you can't. But in a perfect world, what does the legislature need to do in the near future for the system to address the needs?
Well, I would say politely, fund PERS, support the board, and work together. And I hope we continue to work together as we seem to be doing now. You are right. Last year there was the additional $110 million, which we really appreciate. But to put that in perspective, that's roughly half a month's payroll in the PERS system. As far as what to do going forward, I think we need to have additional funding more in line with the actuarial recommendations. And then also I think we need some pension reform, referring to the Tier 5. And the board has voted to recommend the ADEC that was recommended by our actuary of the 25.92% of payroll. So I would say that the additional funding and then also an appropriate Tier 5, as we've already reflected.
Would cash, right now the state has unprecedented, historic levels of cash reserves, thanks to a number of factors. Would a large cash infusion at one time, does that make more of a difference than just a slight increase in the employer payroll contribution? Say put $500 million into the system at one time. Would that have a bigger bang than just increases in the payroll?
Well, under the recent changes in law and the current law, the implementation of any increases is under the purview of the legislature. To go back to that recent ADEC of the 25.92% of payroll, that's estimated at roughly $600 million on an annual recurring basis. And to your question, we would appreciate consideration of any additional funding, and it depends, but for the most part, we need, in the context of the actuarial analysis and reports, a recurring type revenue. But we welcome any type of additional funding they want to consider, whether that be direct appropriations, a cash infusion, using some of the surplus funds, or dedicating a certain amount of potential surplus funds to the PERS unfunded. We certainly appreciate the consideration of any of that, any method of that. But it's important that we have additional funding long term on a more consistent basis.
So what am I mean, this is a complicated issue. I'm over my head at certain times, but I've done my best. But what am I missing that you want to talk about?
Well, just that PERS is we've covered a lot of it. But I would just say again, the PERS is such an important system, not just for the membership, but also for the state. I think we covered the economics, some of it earlier. But in terms of people, it's roughly 10% of the state's population. And
that's not counting their dependents.
That's right. That's direct contact.
And
it's just so important that we work together for the current environment and also for the long-term good. And I would say when it comes to the importance of PERS, whether you're a member or not, you should be interested in this and you should care about this from a financial standpoint and also from a personal standpoint. We'll talk about the human side first. All of the population of Mississippi is touched by a PERS member somehow. I mean, you're thinking about your law enforcement, first responders, teachers, your favorite coach, whomever. Your life is touched by a PERS member. And then from an economic standpoint, not only does it ripple throughout the economy, and so that $3 billion in what is essentially a recession-proof income stream, whether it's going to the tire shop or the Waffle House or the Walmart, that's rippling throughout the economy. And on the topics that we've talked about today, referring to additional funding or pension reform, a Tier 5, I think whether you are a PERS member or a taxpayer, you should support both. And here's why. If you're on the funding, the additional funding, if you're a PERS member or retiree, you should support that because that's needed and good for your retirement system. If you are a taxpayer or a conservative, the longer it goes, the harder it may get and the more it may cost. So you should support some additional funding for PERS. And on the pension reform aspect, the Tier 5, similar reasons. If you're a member, it helps better sustain your existing system for the existing membership. And then as a taxpayer for changing the benefit going forward, hopefully it will reduce some of the projected need for employer increases. So hopefully it's something everybody can come together. I look forward to working with the legislature, and I really appreciate the board's leadership, and hopefully we can work together.
And I'm sorry, before we conclude, real quick, I think you began your tenure at PERS in 2018. You were in the system, a public retirement system in Georgia, I believe, before then.
That's right. I started in July of 2018 officially.
And the current financial issues facing PERS are, and I've heard this from people other than just from you, are a long term. Go back. I mean, there were some changes made that were not financially paid for going back decades and by the legislature. In addition to that, the public employees, the workforce of public employees in the state is actually declining, which there's less money going into the system through the public employees. To talk a little bit about what caused whatever the current issues facing PERS are. Talk a little bit about what caused those.
Oh, certainly. Well, we ultimately are an accumulation of everything that's happened since we were created a little over 70 years ago. But I'll just speak to the last quarter century, last 25 years or so. And in summary, it's a handful of things. In the late 90s and early 2000s, you had some additional benefits placed into law without additional funding at the time.
I think the COLA was changed during that time.
That's right. The current form of the formula was part of those changes. Not the only change, but part of it. So you had that aspect. And then within the last 25 years, that same time frame, you've had the recession in the early 2000s, kind of the dot-com bubble, I guess. You had the Great Recession, maybe a slight downturn with the pandemic. So during that time frame, you had the additional benefits placed into law without additional funding at the time. You've had several economic downturns. You had the declining active to retiree ratio you alluded to, meaning fewer actives paying into the system, more retirees coming onto the system, and retirees living longer. And that's a good thing, but it has a cost. And then the last thing I'll mention is a more conservative approach to public pensions in general, and a couple of examples of that refer to the amortization period and lower assumptions in an interest rate type environment. And all that, those are not bad things, but they've had a cost. And it was almost like a perfect administrative storm from the late 90s to now, and that covers a summary of those factors.
And to wrap it up, it's going to be up to the legislature to decide, because there's people who, and your board pointed this out, that the Tier 5 that was recommended by the board will not be as attractive for new hires as the current system is. And, there's always been the argument that state and public employees, their pay is lower than the private sector, but in Mississippi, there's a good retirement system. So maybe, you can make the argument that the retirement system will not be as good, but as we talked about, your board's priority is to the current membership and to sustaining that system. That's going to be up to the legislature to deal with and to debate those issues during the upcoming session.
That's right. The plan design, any law changes associated with PERS is certainly up to the legislature, but as the benefit design will be up to them. And as you mentioned, the board's role and my role and is as fiduciaries to the system. With that said, though, we look forward to working with the legislature, and there are pros and cons to each approach, whether it be a revised DB like last year, or whether it be the hybrid model as we talked about this week. There are advantages to each one.
But you would concede that what y'all recommended would not be quite as attractive to a new employee as the current system is.
Well, it really depends on one's perspective, and that's something where the employers and some of the stakeholders would, and ultimately the state and the legislature as the sponsor of the plan, but also the employers at the various levels of state government to relay their thoughts and opinions on what would be best for recruitment or retention. And now what I will say just briefly is we do have to realize that there has been a changing workforce and an evolving workforce, if you will. Like the generation before me may have looked at it a certain way, my generation looks at it a certain way, but the ones coming out of college, they may have different interests. So it really just depends. Certainly we support the traditional defined benefit type pension, but the potential hybrid has a lot of advantages as well. But a lot of our focus this week was focusing on how the possibility of this one would help better sustain the existing PERS.
Ray Higgins, I appreciate taking my questions and making them make sense sometimes when they might not have made sense, and helping me muddle through this. You explained it well, and I appreciate it, and hope your holidays go well.
Thank you. Absolutely. Same to you, and thanks for having me.
Okay, thanks.
As we cover the biggest political stories in the state, you don't want to miss an episode of The Other Side. We'll bring you more reporting from every corner of the state, sharing the voices of Mississippians and how they are impacted by the news. So what do we need from you, the listener? We need your feedback and support. Subscribe to our weekly podcast on your favorite podcast app, or stream episodes online at MississippiToday.org/The Other Side. For the Mississippi Today team, I'm Adam Ganeshow. The Other Side is produced by Mississippi Today and engineered by Blue Sky Studios. We hope you'll join us for our next episode.